Catastrophes, Spectres of Trauma and Memory. For this session, we will have three presenters, Revathy Krishnan, Meghal Kalki, and Yutsna Kurvoska. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. The chair of this session is Suman Bhagchandani. She is an assistant professor of English at Shyama Prasad Mukherjee College, University of Delhi, and is a fellow PhD scholar in the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. Her research interests include performing arts, traditions, gender studies, and cinema studies. I welcome you, Suman. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Asmita, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the conference. We have with us our first speaker, Revathy Krishnan. She's a PhD scholar in English at the IIT Madras. Her areas of interest include memory studies, Indian English literature, contemporary life writing, and terrorism and trauma studies. She's a member of the Center for Memory Studies at Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, and the Indian Network for Memory Studies. She's the co-author of Drawing Eco-Sickness, Industrial Disaster Comics, Post-Memory, and the Minamata Story, and Eco-Tragedy. Revathy, I welcome you to the second session, and over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm Revathy Krishnan. I'm a PhD scholar here at the Center for Memory Studies, IIT Madras. I work with Dr. Abhishek Paroi on trauma and terrorism. So before I begin my presentation, I would like to extend my thanks to the organizers of this conference for selecting me. And I'm extremely privileged to be the first speaker of this esteemed conference. Yeah. So I think I can, I'll share my screen right now. Would I be able to share the screen? I think I don't have the permission to do that.
Give us a second.
Yeah.
You're the co-host now, Revathy. You can share your screen.
Thank you so much. Is my screen visible to you?
Yes, it is.
So good evening, everyone. My presentation is titled Witnessing Trauma and Private Memories of Public Terror, reading selected witness narratives of the 26/11 Mumbai attacks. I think we'll have a lot of insights from the earlier keynote session in my paper as well, and I hope I keep you engaged in this. So events of terrorism have historically reconfigured the memories and lived experiences and as well as complex geopolitical realities of people in South Asia and specifically in India. Alex Tickell, in his work Terrorism, Insurgency, and Indian English Literature, notes terrorism as a discourse familiar to the Indian subcontinent since the time of imperialist invasions. Post-independence, terrorism grew as an institutionalized form in India, predominantly functioning as a subsidiary product of extremist ideologies and cross-border conflicts. Terrorism today, in its etymological, practical, and symbolic sense, configure the experiences, life, and memory of the people in India. The intersections of private memories and public commemorations of terrorist attacks in the global south can offer a fresh understanding of the long-standing effects of trauma generated by such events in suffering subjects in a non-Western setting. Ashish Nandi, in his Contemplations on Memory work, notes that the constant mnemonocultural configurations related to traumatic pasts or events like terrorist attacks induce the possibility of, I quote, alternative histories of emotions that refute official invitations to forget and give insights on the multi-layered processes involved in the memory work associated with them. In the context of terror attacks, this study considers witness narratives as crucial in this process, as they implot autobiographical memories of witness communities associated with the terrorist attacks and act as building blocks to the collective memory surrounding the event. These private memories, what Jan Assmann recalls, the communicative memories, are a set of autobiographical, living, and embodied memories of recent pasts held by individuals which are not included in the mainstream historiography. In Asmita's terms, these memories exist in the everyday realities of people and are based on affective ties. As victimhood and rememberings of terror events metamorphose at different points in time, following fresh circumstances, witness narratives become essential indicators of the changing memory cultures as they preserve memories that often evade public histories. In this presentation, I will close read two witness narratives: Praveen Teotia's 2611 Braveheart, My Encounters with Terrorists That Night, published in 2020, and Ankur Chawla's 14 Hours and Insiders account of the 2611, the Taj Attack, to understand the reciprocal relationalities between terrorist attacks, private memories of these attacks in witnesses, and their memory reinstations in the autobiographical narrations using theories of memory studies and narrative theory. So before moving on to the main sections, I'll give you a brief overview of what my presentation for the next 15 minutes is going to be. First, we'll look at what the event is that we are discussing about. Second, we'll talk about the genre, why witness narratives. Then we'll look at the primary text, and I would be looking at the primary text broadly based on three themes. That's from mundane to monumental, earlier memories of terror and future imaginations, newer cartographies of terror and spatial memories. As well as I'll also be looking at the altered materialities in these primary text as well. So, yeah. So the event, Mumbai to 2611. The case study in discussion, the 2611 attacks, were executed in November 2008 by 10 Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorists in Mumbai, where terrorists held influential parts of the city under siege for 4 days. The attacks are considered as one of the country's most significant globally recognized terror attacks. This could be precisely because of two reasons. Firstly, as the event fell right into the conventionally popular definitions of a terror attack, very similar to the 9/11. Secondly, as it was highly mediated, broadcasted, and documented in the form of television coverages and journalistic accounts during and post its occurrence. Several literary clusters have been formed around trauma narratives associated with terror situations in the country, namely the Jammu and Kashmir situation, the Northeastern militancy, Maoist insurgency, and several many. But however, very few have attempted to exclusively study the structure of memory mechanisms of the 2611 attacks, especially in witnesses. So I'll be examining narratives that throw light on how their life changed, particularly after this incident and its effects on memory. So again, coming back to the question of why witness narratives, why the genre, or I would be explaining what the genre is. And I think at the end of the explanation, you would understand why witness narratives. So Julie Rack introduced the term witness narrative in 2001 as a newer form of autobiographical life writing, where the subjectivity of the writer, I quote, is built around an event, quite often a traumatic event. While life writing has evolved into a collective term for all biographical and autobiographical narrative documentation, or as Mita Banerjee defines in the Handbook of Autobiography, I quote, it is a wider continuum of all ego documents, written or composed in various media, which allows us to express the story of ourselves, unquote. Over the years, the primary function of all life writing has been the documentation of experiences, either immediately or in retrospect. Unlike other prominent forms of self-writing, where the actual causality of events constructs the narrative structure of the text, Rack categorizes witness narratives as a form of writing structured on the narrator's ability to recount the event or how they witnessed it. They record the personal, autobiographic, and private memories of witnesses of an event and their effective responses to them in the post-event scenario. So moving on to our primary text in discussion, this study identifies the books Ankur Chawla's 14 Hours and Praveen Teotia's 2611 Braveheart as witness narratives, There are accounts of two individuals who encountered the Mumbai 26/11 attacks in the same place, Hotel Taj, Mumbai, in different capacities, one as a rescue personnel and another as a staff member, respectively. Ankur Chawla is one among the hotel staff contingent of the Taj Mumbai, who first saw the terrorists advancing into the hotel and also took part actively in rescuing the guests safely out of the hotel through the staff corridors. Praveen Teotia was a Marine commando in the Western Naval Command and was among the one of the first teams to be deployed in the hotel for rescue operations. So now we'll move on to the main discussion of my paper. From mundane to monumental, witnessing emotions and changing mnemonic relationalities. So terrorist events are emotionally charged occurrences that recategorize the narrative coherence of memory. Whenever a life-altering event occurs, seemingly mundane experiences become monumental episodes. The set of everyday memories of activities that people go about in their daily lives undergo a sudden and massive change due to the terror situation. The emotions induced by the act of witnessing, such as horror, fright, and shock, transform the mundane everyday memories into a realm of heightened emotions, making it a significant episodic memory with rich event-specific knowledge. Ankur Chawla's first memory of witnessing the terrorist shooting, August, changes the tone of the life narrative into a witness narrative with a profound and pertinent sensory impact. His sensory imaginations undergo a radical change to a plain, gory, and horrific. Ankur Chawla in his narrative recalls the memory of seeing a man falling into the corridor after being shot by the terrorists. He reports vivid descriptions of the bleeding victim, such as the blood oozing out of the white shirt of the person, the multitude of emotions in his eyes, and the fear of death. The fear in this instance becomes the pivotal emotion around which the whole memory of witnessing is constructed. The relivable quality of the fear makes the witness remember the memories of these events in detail. As Qasim and Joshua Jacobs note, the emotional events like terrorist attacks often evade traumatic erasures and are recalled with precision due to their emotional valency. Similarly, Catherine Malibu also notes in her book, The Ontology of the Accident, that the known realities and the memories associated with a known space are defamiliarized in the backdrop of a disruptive event like the terrorist attack. Even though the injury of the man who got shot twice is removed from Ankur, he compares his helplessness to that of the dead man. Ankur recollects the bullet injury of the man and the act of witnessing it as a mental wound that disrupted his stream of everyday memories. The author recounts the instance as a moment where both the dead subject and the remembering subject is encountered with the same emotion and is engulfed by it. After witnessing the terror attack, elements like the materiality of the bar where he was in duty at that time, the expensive alcohol, the daily chores that defined Ankur's memory organization until then, turned insignificant. On the other hand, newer memory organizations based on future imaginations of death, safety from bullets, and the security of inhabitants come into place. As Malibu notes, the event of an unprecedented act or witnessing deterritorialize the consumed chronotype of a familiar space. These chronotopic qualities are not just built around the physicality of the space. On the other hand, they're deeply controlled by the emotions surrounding those spatial memories. Ankur's autobiographical memories prove that accidents like terror attacks and the resultant violence are not merely instances of spatial decapitation, but they cause a sudden and complex overturn of emotions floating around a space and are seminal indicators in tracing the process of deterritorialization in the subjective memories. In a similar fashion, Praveen Teotia also confesses to have experienced bouts of helplessness, depression, anxiety, and haunting images of the terrorist attack in dreams and other psychological issues like PTSD. He also remembers being mocked, humiliated, and disrespected by his colleagues for being physically disadvantaged in a force that demanded a healthy and robust body. Teotia bears evidence of visible trauma in his body, like his mutilated ear and lead pieces in his lungs that remain as material reminders of terror that are not susceptible to forgetting. According to Joseph Ledoux and Richard Brown, emotional memories underlying certain events are not exposed to erasures. In particular, the memories of emotions like shock, suffering, humiliation, surprise, fear are better remembered, which becomes the case for events like 26/11. Similarly, we observe that sense memories associated with strong emotions continue to linger years after the traumatic terror. For example, in 26/11 Braveheart, Teotia recollects waking up after being shot in acute pain and agony, burning sensation in his skin being ripped apart, the fire of hell engulfing his neck. He elaborates that it felt like, I quote, 1,000 hammers were being pounded on his skull and molten lava was poured inside his ears, unquote. He recalls trying to touch his ear to end up knowing that no ear was left, and except a few hanging tissues. He remembers the smells of gunpowder, the ferric smell of blood, and antiseptics. Similarly, Chawla remembers the first time he heard the sound of gunshots. His initial reactions were that he thought someone had broken a champagne bottle where he is in duty. The sensory imagination of the author until this point is formed out of the bar and its materiality, where the loud bang could have been nothing but the breaking of an alcohol bottle. However, with the subjectivity of a terrorist entering a very familiar space, the triviality of the experiences undergo a paradigm shift. The rhetorical transition in Chawla's narration indicating the mutability of normalcy and its abrupt production of strangeness shaped the employment of the memory narrative. Interestingly, both the authors in discussion also recount light-hearted moments amidst the threatening situations. These memories give us insights into how memories of crisis situations are polar in nature. They're sometimes not just about shock, fear, and uncertainty. Light-hearted emotions and dark humor are also product of crises and are retained in witness memories. While these humorous instances could have been easily dismissed, the witnesses remembering them with clarity, along with other severely traumatic memories, is distinctively peculiar. It highlights how emotional markers in memory are encoded and leave their residual impact even during reconstruction. Moving on to the second theme that I'll be discussing on, earlier memories of terror and future imaginations. The ground zero site, Mumbai, that we're discussing had witnessed multiple terror attacks prior to 26/11. This is reflected on in how people respond to the initial chaos created by the 26/11 attacks. Ankur Chawla recalls how the elites in Taj Mumbai were taken aback by the gunshot, and I quote, speculating and debating about the possible sources of the sound, while the foreigners in the bar panicked. I quote, the other Indian guests tried to make the situation lighter by saying, do not worry, sir, this is quite common. The security guys know how to tackle it. These instances are critical in understanding how memory work calibrates emotional responses in people. The commonness of the situation and the familiarity of the Mumbai crowd with gunshots designed their early responses to the attack. Memories of witnessing or receiving news about tiffs between gangster groups in Mumbai with the police led people to the conclusion that the armed commotion that they heard could have been anything but an ordinary occurrence the system is already equipped to take care of. Ankur remembers snippets of memory that he holds about the conversation he had with the chefs in the kitchen quickly after the first encounter with the terrorist. The chefs comment that this could be anything like a minor skirmish between guests or a gang war. He even remembers statements like, do you think that Dawood Ibrahim is back? But why here in Mumbai? They should have gone to Delhi. They should have bombed the parliament instead. These memories provide us with similar information that proves that the initial responses to acts of terror were highly shaped by their prior memories of terror attacks and the popular narratives of terrorism in India. The metonymies that witnesses refer to are indicators of what the nation knows and remembers about terrorist attacks in the country. One cannot also evade the widespread faith held by the hotel's inhabitants that places of an elite and luxurious stature like Taj Mumbai would be untouched by such activities. This is also indicative of the fact that our prior memories of terror carve a cartography of vulnerable spaces based on its possibility and exposure to terror attacks, the dynamics of which are determined by the presence and absence of communities of different economic orders. Ankur also uses metaphors pertinent to decode how memories, imagination, and language coordinate in witnesses. Ankur writes, while describing the advancing of terrorists, I quote, just like it happens in Bollywood movies, when a villain intrudes into a party in the climax and takes the heroine as hostage, terrorists walk into the bar. Here, the metaphor used is an indicator of two things. Firstly, the perception of terror situations is hugely influenced by the contingency situations projected by multiple media, films, and works of fiction.
Hi, you are left with 2 more minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the reminder. Yeah. Firstly, for the placement of the metaphor is not just a determiner of the possible reality rooted in past imagination, but also an indicator of a possible turn of events that are ahead. So using a Bollywood villain as an example or a metaphor itself is very pertinent to the space in which the whole terror event unfolded. So moving on to the third category, newer cartographies of terror and spatial memories. While the discussion so far focused on the remembrance patterns of terror in witness narratives, one cannot miss but notice the relationality of these memories with the space. Witness narratives, while portraying ghastly the experiences of the terror event, also project the reconfiguration of these spaces. Violent acts like terror attacks transformed organized landscapes and reconfigure the space into a chronotop of terror. The witness narratives, instead of embodying scenes of traumatic realism, present before the reader a spectacle of dichotomy and spatio-temporal distortions. During a terror attack, seemingly mundane spaces transform into destabilized zones, altering the ecology of memories associated with that space. Also with new subjectivities, that of a terrorist or an individual imparting violence, entering the space, the cartography of the space is reconstructed. Teotia calls how he looked at the Taj before the Hotel Taj before the terror event as a as a architectural marvel, a piece of beauty. However, immediately after he entered into the hotel after the terror attacks, he notes how the lazy opulence of the hotel had been replaced by a shaken inferno, where he had to walk over bullet-ridden bodies, pulling out living survivors underneath dead victims. So these stark differences in the spatial memories indicate the volatile nature of human-space relations. There are multiple instances in this matter. I think I am limited by time, so I would quickly conclude. So as we go on in this paper and the observations from it, we identify that the Indian responses to terrorism are quite distinct in quality, primarily due to their familiarity with earlier terror events and the memories that shape their imaginations. Unlike the Western world, terror was something closer in reality for India. The insights from the text prove that even when events like 26/11 lose shock value, the memories of terror in witness communities continue with substantial reinstations of emotions and psychosomatic damages. Insights from these witness accounts prove that victimhood of survivors and haunting memories of the event require critical academic attention. I would like to conclude with an observation that Professor Tim Wilson made, that genesis and not aftermath has tended to dominate the study of terrorism. So narratives in discussion provide readers with experiences absent in the mainstream narratives and illuminate the sustaining impacts of terror attacks in the country. So by adopting a bottom-up approach to understand the larger memory ecology surrounding terror through witness narratives gives us an understanding of memories, absent in absent in mainstream historiographies that would have otherwise gone unreported. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Thanks again to the organizers of the conference for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Revathy. That was a really interesting presentation. I think Asmita would take over as the moderator and pose the questions to you directly. And I'll reserve my comments for later.
Okay, so I can see there's a question here. Someone has asked, the study emphasizes the role of witness narratives in foregrounding marginalized voices of survivor communities. So how might this contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of the larger nexus of trauma surrounding terrorist events in India?
Thank you so much for the question. And I think the primary aim of this whole study is to look at how these witness narratives function in visibilizing the trauma and the experiences of the victims of terrorism and the survivors of terrorism. Often we look at terrorist attacks as something that institutionally there is a prescriptive forgetting of events like these, because it looks at the failure of our defense system in some way. However, the people like Ankur Chawla or Praveen Teotia are people who are living with the trauma. I mean, they cannot remove the trauma from their realities. These trauma is reshaping their life. And I personally observed that when we look at trauma and terrorism as a larger nexus of study, we look at more primarily at terrorist attacks that have happened outside India. But then, like, considering India having a longer history of terrorism in the country, I mean, professors like Dr. Meenakshi Bharat has done extremely good work in terms of how fictional works look at terrorism as a theme. But my work focuses more on how witnesses remember it, and what are the implications of those memories in their current life. So through witness narratives. I hope I have answered the question.
Thank you. So there's another question for you. How do the narratives of Praveen Teotia and Ankur Chawla provide a unique perspective on 26/11 terror attacks, considering that they had different roles during the events?
I mean, that would come back to the question of, rather than homogenizing memories as a single category, we are looking at how, I would hark back to what, what was the input from the earlier discussion, like there should be a balance of stories, as Chinua Achebe says. So we need multiple, memories of people involved. And it's not just about a certain group of, I think the discussion today and the presentation of mine today was highly limited by the, the stature of the participants involved. There are a lot more books that, or a lot more narratives that, of extremely ordinary people who were involved in this and who don't get that much of attention in the mainstream historiography. I think narratives like these, and even digital media, is playing a huge role in calibrating and consolidating these experiences in terms of especially events like 26/11 in the country. So.
Thank you. So Suman, if you have any remarks.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much, Revathy, and thank you, Asmita. Just a quick point that I just want to throw over there for you to think about and not take too much time, because we are also short on time here. So I was thinking, because you were talking about witness narratives, and you were talking about kind of an ego documentation that takes place where you kind of selectively choosing what to present in the form of a narrative and revisiting those memories. I wanted you to perhaps think about how, when you're putting it in the structure of a book and you're putting it in a print form, it takes a certain shape. There's a kind of a limitation. There's a certain kind of a structurality of the book that is required. As opposed to that, how do these witness narratives shape up on digital platforms? Especially when they are like turned into blogs and pages, and as I believe 2611 has a website of its own. So you kind of through drop-down menus revisit certain quote-unquote events of this particular period, as you've said. So just wanted to throw this thought forward and kind of at you. And with that note, I'll also move to our next speaker. And maybe if we have time later on, we can circle back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Suman, for that question. Thank you. I'll look into it.
Thank you. So we'll move to Meghal Karki very quickly then. She's a PhD scholar in English at the School of Letters, Ambedkar University, Delhi. She's an alumnus of Jamia Millia Islamia and the University of Delhi. She has a keen interest in folklore, affect theory, spatial studies, literary theory, and post-colonial literatures, and is a novice Angela Carter aficionado. So over to you, Karki.
Thank you, Suman, for the introduction. I'll just quickly share my screen and then begin. Yeah, just give me a second to do that. Is my screen visible? Yeah, okay. So I'll just begin. My paper is titled Towards an Aesthetics and Atmosphere of Remembrance, Memorializing the Trauma of Jallianwala Bagh. On April 13, 1919, a group of approximately 20,000 people had gathered to peacefully protest against the draconian Rowlatt Act when General Dyer ordered that the only entrance of the Jallianwala Bagh, a narrow passage, be sealed, and indiscriminately began firing on the crowd without any warning. The violence unleashed what scholars agree to be the first major anti-colonial nationalist movement. The atrocities of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre are well known and documented, and I will move forward with the assumption that the listeners are informed about the scale of the violence that was unleashed, because I'm also limited by time, and I have a few photographs that will perhaps be sufficient to explore the materiality of the remnants of violence. So post-independence, the site was developed into a memorial of national importance in 1951, and in 2019, a 20 crore renovation project was announced, which was overseen by Varma Communications of Ahmedabad, and who worked in tandem with ASI and NBCC to mark 100 years of the massacre. The renovated site was inaugurated in August 2021 and included several new features, which have severely been critiqued by historians, academics, and activists who have argued against the Disneyfication and commodification of the memorial. So my paper will delve into the recent renovation in detail and highlight the ways in which these changes have altered the very atmosphere of the place and how it stands in stark contrast to other memorials such as Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp and the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, and will attempt to navigate certain questions surrounding atmospheres and aesthetics, particularly how do we memorialize sites of violence and traumatic memory, and what does the departure in aesthetics at the Jallianwala Bagh reveal? I will try and answer these questions through by referring to Gernaubaum's conceptions of atmosphere, and it will also be informed by Patricia Violi's ideas about trauma sites. So while the appearance of the term atmosphere and its associated concepts such as vibe, mood, and ambience may seem like recent additions to everyday discourse and the discourse of aesthetics, they've been around for centuries. Gernaubaum, in his seminal essay, Atmosphere is a Fundamental Concept of a New Aesthetics, points out that atmospheres are vague, slippery, evasive, and indeterminate, and they fill the space with a certain toll of feeling like a haze. They're quasi-objective in certain senses, but are not things in themselves and require a sentient subject to feel, apprehend, and constitute them, and consequently they exist intersubjectively. They're not a pure emergence, as Bosch calls them, but can be and are deliberately constructed in staging, film, architecture, interior design, urban planning, advertising, and branding to manufacture an aesthetic quality of a space that is certainly subjective, but also draws on some commonplace assumptions, conceptions, and a shared cultural vocabulary. They also pertain to the production of particular receptions or to types of receptions by viewers or consumers that play a role in in the production of the work itself and are consequently an exercise of power. A note that I must make before proceeding further is that there's never any guarantee that everybody is necessarily affected by the atmosphere of a space as intended and produced. However, the argument leans towards the ways in which these experiences are conditioned. Examining architecture through the lens of atmosphere contributes to two major shifts in the study of aesthetics, which is a shift away from what something represents to how something is presented, and a shift from the form or shape of things to the complex and shifting ways in which they engage with the space of our bodily presence. Atmospheric architectures present a deeply insightful theoretical framework through which we can unravel the myriad ways in which trauma sites and memorials affect us. These connections have been drawn before, particularly in the context of trauma sites, and Boch has argued that the Holocaust Tower in the Jewish Museum in Berlin produces an oppressive atmosphere that any visitor is likely to feel, and that every encounter with architecture contains the possibility of being seized by an atmosphere. Sabina Tambovic has also added that there's a dark, sacred atmosphere to the Holocaust Tower, and the elements combined together make us think of the religious sacred. So these memorials offer us a unique path through which we can attempt to understand the renovation of the Jallianwala Bagh site and its impact. So the next section of my paper is titled Atmospheres, Trauma Sites and Memorials, Contextualizing Memory and Remembrance. Throughout the history of human civilization, acts of unconscionable violence have been committed by different groups on others, and they continue to persist even today. Commemorative actions and practices such as building memorials have become an increasingly widespread and well-established part of our cultural toolkit. Sites such as the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, the killing fields of Cambodia, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, and the Murambi Genocide Memorial in Rwanda are a few well-known examples. Memorials are constructed for a wide array of reasons, but primarily mark sites of trauma and grief and seek to publicly address and acknowledge the violent histories of recent wars, genocides, and systematic human rights abuses. On the other hand, trauma sites, or sites of trauma, as Patrizia Violi prefers to call them, are the sites wherein violence was unleashed and the victims perished then and there. They stand, as Violi writes, as material testimonies of the violence and horrors that took place. So this difference is critical in order to understand the challenges that accompany the process of designing and showcasing a site of trauma to the public, as trauma sites retain a real spatial contiguity with the trauma itself, which is absent in the case of memorials. The visual and architectural ways in which the violence of the site is fully showcased needs to be directed in a nuanced manner, as visitors to the site often rely on them to reinterpret the historical trauma of the site, particularly in the absence of sites that contain of first-hand experience of trauma. Violi further writes that trauma sites contain an embodied memory of the actual agent that caused them and are testimonies of the past themselves and bear the traces and imprints of that violence. The process of designing the site, modifying and staging the myriad aspects of the sites becomes significantly more complex and multifaceted, as the ways in which the visitors conceive of and imagine the past through the visual and architectural elements of the site also need to be considered and imagined. Additionally, yet another layer is added to trauma sites as they become sites of commemoration through additions of memorial monuments and museums after the violence. These terms and categorizations, as we can see, are not set in stone. They shift and overlap constantly, but an important point of contextualization needs to be established here. So I'll now proceed to talk about the renovation of the Jallianwala Bagh. Now, ever since the Bagh was renovated, and it has received, as I said before, significant criticism, and it has been critiqued as the additions are not seen in conformity with what existed and have played, as critics argue, in destroying the historical proof and authenticity of the memorial, because the renovation hides the tragedy faced by the martyrs, which was written all over the wall by the bullets of General Dyer. These editions include there are several new editions which have been listed on the screen, and due to the time restriction, I will talk particularly about the narrow entrance, the addition of an exit, and also the glass barrier around the martyr's well. So the addition of human sculptures and statues that protrude from the walls and the bright lighting to the narrow entrance of the Jallianwala Bagh is a feature that has received the very significant criticism and has altered the atmospheric dimensions of the site. The passage had played a significant role in the massacre as it was the only entrance and exit to the site, while there were other gates that led to small alleys but were locked on that day. So the hitherto untouched and unadorned narrow lane thus remained a haunting reminder of the horrors of the trauma of the site and a vital vestige of a violent colonial past. In a time when traces and memories of colonialism have begun fading, the Jallianwala Bagh remained a material and tangible testimony to the horrors of the colonial endeavor that communicated important information about the political and social conditions associated with death and loss. As we attempt to reconstruct the past, we creatively reimagine the past and the future, and I quote from Baum, a unique synthesis of present lived experience and reconstruction of past narratives and facts in that present experience is constructed through the memorial and the trauma site. The passage, preserved as it was, used to evoke a somber, unadorned, untouched atmosphere that enabled the visitors to interact with the violence of the bloody day as it was and experience, and I quote purely here, an almost unimaginable felt reality of the past. End quote. There's a pertinent need to reiterate that it's not possible that every single subject has the same reaction to the space, but atmospheres and architecture, we need to remember, are constructed and oriented through spatial additions, obliterations, changes, and also through light and sound. The additions of the statues and sculptures alter the atmosphere of the place and infringe on the sanctity of the lane and the sacrifice of the martyrs. Earlier, the passage also featured, as you can see, the doors and windows of the neighboring structures, and melded as a part of the urban landscape and situated in its urban context. However, they are now hidden under the statues, thus creating a rupture with the neighborhood and now stand apart as a site. There's also a rupture in aesthetics of the site as the copper-colored statues stand at odds with the sandstone walls of the alley that Gurmeet Rai asserts evoke a certain behavior among visitors, which undermines, according to him, the spirit of the place. And Neha Khitterpal, who has also worked on the site, calls it a rupture in political aesthetics at the site of trauma. While Baum was building his ideas about the relationship between architecture and atmosphere, he had argued that buildings accentuate and focus the sense of space, and they also entail movement suggestions, convey experiences of narrowness or expansiveness, and they articulate space itself as an expanse. These articulations, of course, are reliant on the experiencing subject and consequently a space of bodily sensing, a sensing that reaches out into that indeterminate expanse, takes shape and redirects the orientation of the perceiving subject. So the renovations have included the addition of a rather curious phenomena, and that is the addition of an exit to the Jallianwala Bagh, which alters the experience of the trauma site because there wasn't an exit, and this rupture further prevents the visitors from experiencing the site like the martyrs. The martyrs' well has been I'll move on to the martyrs' well, which was also a distinguishing feature of the Jallianwala Bagh and one of the most material and visceral remnants of the violence that was unleashed. Confined to the Bagh in a death trap with nowhere to hide, the victims fell and deliberately jumped into the deep well at the site to escape the bullets. A stupa structure was built around the well to ensure safety, and the visitors could gauge the depth of the well by peering into it and imagine and engaged with the memory of the victims who jumped into it. However, the renovations now include a glass panel that encircles the well and provides a visual and tactile barrier that prevents them from interacting and engaging with the site. These new additions are not memorial structures in any form and alter the architectural dynamics of the site and may possibly be an attempt to shift the focus from commemoration and remembrance to glorifying the sacrifice of the martyrs. Neha Khitterpal has drawn on the work of Kathleen Higgins and makes a pertinent argument by highlighting that it is imperative that the martyrs' relationship with the objects and places of the trauma site are maintained as this remains a vital path towards filling the void by resituating the deceased within space and time. The massacre happened over 100 years ago, and there have been no sustained efforts to track down and record the experience of the surviving victims systematically, or even approach the experiences of the second generation of the victims. So consequently, the site becomes more critical than ever to understand and comprehend the extent of the violence and preserve it over time. However, there's something that we must also pay attention to. Atmospheres are not reducible to objects or subjects and are shaped by both the built environment and the natural environment. There's no atmosphere without perceiving subjects. And if we choose to simply focus on the renovation of the built atmosphere, built environment and design plans, then the openness of the concept of atmosphere is closed off. The Jallianwala Bagh has not remained a static memorial, but has transformed as visitors and tourists have engaged with the site.
Meghal,
Yeah.
2 more minutes.
Okay, all right. So I'll just quickly wrap it up. So as you can see, research has been conducted, and you can see the comments of the people who have visited other trauma sites like Auschwitz, and there's a memorial in Hungary as well. And they have listed out the stark contrast between their experiences there and at Jallianwala Bagh. And the idea that emerges recurrently is that it feels just like a park, which also invites us to rethink that the Jallianwala Bagh is a trauma site, a memorial, and a garden, and this combination lends a fluidity to its meanings and causes the aesthetic elements of the site to be in stark contradiction with its tragic past. It has, Gurmeet Rai has argued that the Jallianwala Bagh has acquired over time the atmosphere of a local park and invaluable open space in an urban fabric and a site for leisure and relaxation, which is similar to the significance that India Gate holds in Delhi, which invites us to think about memorials and trauma sites in a post-colonial India and the shifting narratives of the same. I'll quickly conclude that as memories of colonialism fade with time, practices of commemoration in the forms of memorials and trauma sites become even more critical. And this is just a humble attempt to investigate and highlight the ways in which the atmosphere of the of Jallianwala Bagh has shifted post the renovations. The remaining few traces of the events have been recoded, rewritten, and re-inscribed by an aesthetics and narrativization that remains at odds with the nature of the site. So certain questions remained, which I've listed out on the screen, and how, they basically invite us to rethink about how can we conceive of Indian cultures of commemoration that do not compromise with the aesthetics of remembrance, and how do we account for the ways in which the meanings and associations of memorials shift with time. Neha Khitterpal has shown a way in which the Khadi marigold has been used to commemorate the victims on 2019 by large bouquets at the Partition Museum in Amritsar, and has shown that how we can perhaps find a middle ground between vernacular memorialization, official narratives, and the spatial limitations of the Jallianwala Bagh site. So I realize I've closed off with more questions than answers or any solutions, but hopefully an attempt has been made to open up a space for continuing discourse on a topic whose relevance, I feel, remains unchanged and perhaps even more urgent than before. So thank you.
I second you on that, Meghal. Thank you so much for the paper. We are flooded with thoughts and questions here. So I'll just pass the digital mic to Asmita to take over.
Hi, really, really interesting presentation, Meghal. We can only take one question because we don't have a lot of time. So Chitra is asking you, what do you think is the significance of these monuments which are built to commemorate significant traumatic events? Do they help the people to deal with the trauma better, or they work as the carrier of trauma and memory?
Okay, thank you for the question. So the significance, as we can see, there are several reasons behind why memorials are constructed, and we can categorize. They are also, for some people, it is a way to deal with the loss. For particularly, I've read accounts by the relatives and the following generations of the surviving victims, and for them, these sites remain a particularly pertinent ways in which the suffering is acknowledged by the nation state, and an experience of the same by other visitors is deemed to be vital by the surviving generations. At the same time, there also often memorials are often overridden by certain nationalistic narratives, and they are re-inscribed with time. I would quickly just give an example of a memorial in Kanpur, which had been constructed by the British as to commemorate and memorialize the lives of 127 women and children that were lost during the 1857 mutiny. On the day of independence, on 15th August 1947, a huge crowd came over and vandalized the Angel of Resurrection, and the memorial park was renamed by the mastermind of the attack which had led to the loss of life and was a significant historical figure. So there are shifting ways in which memorials and their meanings transform over time and are rewritten by the narratives that by those in power, and that this is an example of the ways in which they assume a significance in the post-colonial state at present. So I hope I've answered this question partly, I hope.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Meghal. Asmita, should we then move on to the next speaker? Right. So we have with us Dr. Jyotsna Kruska, who is a lecturer in Hindi at the Department of Indology at the University of Würzburg in Germany. She obtained her PhD in 2019 from the Institute of Oriental Studies at the University of Warsaw, focusing on the aesthetics of death and dying in modern Hindi literature. She held the position of Assistant Professor at the Department of Modern South Asian Languages and Literatures at the South Asia Institute, University of Heidelberg. Additionally, she's also worked as a lecturer at the Department of Linguistics and Philology at Uppsala University and as a research assistant at the University of Bonn. Her areas of research focus on prison writing, memory studies, food cultures, and written oral narratives of convicts from the penal colony in the Andaman Islands. Dr. Kruska, over to you, please.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I don't see an option to share my screen, but maybe this will appear soon. So I will be talking about Bengal famine today, about secondary trauma, famine in the Hindi literati, Hindi narrative of Bengal famine in Hans Literary Magazine. So I wanted to start with an introduction of how I came across this topic. So I started with the reading of Hindi novels, and in particularly Hindi novels which appeared just directly after Bengal famine in 1946. And I was really astonished and partly disappointed because they were, to some extent, quite bizarre and appropriative reactions to the Bengal famine. And I will just, I wanted to read out a quote from a particular novel by Amritlal Nagar. His novel Hunger, in Hindi called Bhuk, appeared in 1946, and in that novel, he in the introduction he says, in 1943, the Bengal famine shook me. 2 years earlier, while unemployed, I had gone without food for 4 days. Before that, my friend Mahesh Kaul, a film director, and I had lived on half-empty stomachs for months. My personal experience began to connect my mind to something bigger. The Bengal famine's hardships seemed to be a part of my own intimate struggle. When I decided to write a novel about it, I needed to understand the background of the famine in my own way. My own, that is, an individual's experience, linked as they are to the social, political, and psychological context, began to fathom the social dimension of the famine. While the famine was still raging, I decided to write a social novel. Just as I had collected real stories of the time to construct the scenes and characters of the novel, I also noted all stories and accounts of events from my family and neighborhood. I still have the same register of memories. So as you can see, he starts with just comparing his experience of being hungry for several days and just not eating enough food to the experiences of famine. And this struck me as quite a bizarre comparison. And that's why I started to look into a dialogue between Bengali and Hindi narratives. And I was particularly interested if this kind of keeps repeating in other works. And I quickly noticed that contrary to the novels, the shorter accounts, like short stories and some other parts included in literary magazines, are quite different. And thus I started looking at Hans magazine and particularly being interested in topics as ownership of trauma, of memory, and appropriation or of certain memories, on secondary trauma, the issue of representation and calling for a necessity of having or giving voice, and in this case, who is giving voice to whom, and generally voice in literature. And then I came across Michael Rothberg's work, Implemented Subject, Multidirectional Memory, and Traumatic Realism. And then I started using his terminology. And thus I argued that the representation of Bengal famine is subject to similar contradictions as the representation of any other trauma in a work of art. Writers and readers alike are confronted with the radical problem of understanding between the event's uniqueness and typicality. Rothberg argues that the most useful aesthetic approach to this conundrum is so-called traumatic realism, which simultaneously documents, reflects on the limits of representation, and engages with different discourses of representation, thus creating a pedagogical value. According to Rothberg, traumatic realism is the most helpful tool for creating narratives about trauma, understood, according to Cathy Caruth, not as an event, but as the structure of its experience, and describing the encounter with death, but also its survival and the coming after. As we shall see in the following analysis, the strategy can be applied very accurately to the text describing the experience of the Bengal famine. In examining the Hindi texts of the famine, we encounter another of Rothberg's concepts, the implicated subject idea. Texts on trauma often point to the act of witnessing and victimization. And to counter this politicization, Rothberg develops the concept of the implicated subject, a non-victim, non-perpetrator, taking into account the indirect, structural, collective forms of agency and complicity. Implicated subjects occupy positions of power and privilege without being directly agents of harm. And now back to the Hans magazine, to my material. So Hans is one of the oldest and most prestigious Hindi language literary magazines, as you probably know. It was founded by Premchand in the 30s in Benares, and with the modest aim of promoting Hindi in Devanagari script. The monthly continued under the editorship of Premchand's son, Amrit Rai, from 1942. To 1952, when it closed due to financial difficulties. It was later on successfully revived by Rajendra Yadav in '86 until his death in 2013, and is still functioning under the leadership of his daughter, Rajana. But the period which interests us is the period of Bengal famine, 43 to 46. And at this point, Amrit Rai was editing the magazine. He was only 21 when he began to lead Hans. And as we all know, this happened to be a year of great national turmoil with the Quit India movement, most of the leaders of the national movement in detention, the war at its peak, and the Great Bengal famine of 43 as well. Amrit Rai, a staunch Gandhian, quickly mobilized other writers and activists, especially Mahadevi Verma and other poets, to agitate and collect funds for the famine victims. A collective volume was brought to life called Bangu Darshan, and it was widely circulated, and all the money collected went into a relief fund. Many of Amrit Rai's associates, friends, and authors he admired, as well as many debutants, contributed text to various Hans issues to highlight the importance of this traumatic event. According to Amrit Rai's biographer, his attitude was that, I quote, "Literature is a weapon. Literature is propaganda, an ideological tool. Our words are our equipment." Initially, a progressive journal, Hans published the majority of writers of this persuasion. Mukti Bodh, Kedarnath Agarwal, Girja Kumar Mathur, Raghuveer Sahai, and many more, and Ramvilas Sharma, for example. But for purpose of this study, I have only looked at Hans issues published between 1943 and 1947. I was able to locate most of them. Unfortunately, the collection of the copies which I looked at, which I had at Hindi Sahitya Sammelan in Prayag, was in some cases not so good. So some pages were missing, damaged, some covers were misplaced, and so on. But I was able to identify 8 issues published between October 43 and March 47, which contained single or multiple texts on the Bengal famine. Let's say 40 or so texts, which are short or long poems, songs, one-act plays, short stories, editorials, and essays. The editors were, for most of the cases, Amrit Rai, and in some cases for poetry, Ramvilas Sharma and Shivdan Singh Chauhan. But not every time the editor is explicitly mentioned in each copy of the magazine, thus I'm not 100% sure. Interestingly, for the texts initially written in languages other than Hindi, because some of the texts are originally in Bengali or Urdu, the translators' names are also not mentioned, and also not the source language. So this is quite bizarre. One has to know that. Let me give some examples. So texts are by writers as most of the time young authors under the age of 35. For example, Rangi Raghav, Prakash Gupta, Krishnan Chandar, and Bijan Bhattacharya, for example. His one-act play, Jabanbandi, translated as Antim Bhattacharya, is still performed, is still very well known. Some of the literary responses included in Hans, responses to famine, I would say lack insight into the historical and social background, concentrating exclusively on the appearances and actions of the destitute who commit despicable immoral acts. The physicality of starving bodies, bones, hands, sunken eyes, and other, let's call them medical symptoms of famine, and the bestial behavior of those affected often becomes the focus of texts. They are sometimes pornographic in nature, and I use the pornographic in a metaphorical way, also after Rothberg. Such images aim to construct a famine version of concentrational universe, featuring a particular type of victimhood, which does not necessarily mean being immediately gone or disappearing, dying, but to contrary, being present and visible in a very physical way, just being there to be looked at. Let me give some more examples. Devendra Satyarthi, who was a famous and productive folklorist and writer, is contributing a story which is called Kabron ke Bichon Beach to the January 44 issue. And in this story, a group of student members of the Communist Party travels to a remote village to collect data about the number of deaths in Bengal. They hope that the publication of a shocking statistic would motivate more rapid transfer of grains from other states. One day they visit a village in which only 10 people survived and who are so weak they cannot bury the corpses anymore and dispose of them in a nearby river. The expedition comes across an elderly woman who lost her children and has no strength to dig more graves. One of the students looks at her leaving the graveyard and sees all her dead sons following her. And this is the conclusion of the story. One more example, Krishnan, one of his most famous works is the story which is included in the Hans magazine, Andatta, so the giver of grain. It is reprinted in April 1944 issue of Hans in the Vanagari transcription, not the entire text, but 20 pages of it, which constitutes roughly 1/3 of the magazine. So it's quite sizable. The text takes up the form of thoughts of dying and even dead victims of famine, letters, and satirical and shocking descriptions of the life of the Allies, consciously ignoring hungry individuals literally begging for food at their doorsteps. And the Allies just living their lavish lives regardless of the reality and ridiculing anyone pleading for action. The text brings familiar motifs that keep repeating in other works on famine, descriptions of piles of dead bodies being removed from the city for aesthetic reasons, children abandoned by their mothers or waiting next to their dead bodies, disbelief in the scale of the tragedy, and suspicion of manipulation. It features...
Ma'am, you have 2 more minutes.
Okay, perfect. I could give some more examples, but I still have roughly 38 texts. But then I will just go directly to the conclusion of authors who published on the Bengal famine and all the issues under analysis, more than Hindi authors under the age of 35, some of them debuting. Only a few were established senior writers such as Nirala or Mahadevi Verma, who were, however, well acquainted with the editor of Hans. Most of the issues featured short and long poems, and lyrics seem to play an essential role in giving a poetic, non-descriptive tone to the traumatic events in Bengal. Contrary to Hans' usual repertoire, not many short stories find a place in the magazine, concentrating on one-act plays and editorial texts, apart from the already mentioned poems and songs. Most of the texts are originally in Hindi and weren't previously published. It is a striking feature of Hans under the editorship of Amrit Rai, who took it over in 1942, to devote so many pages, sometimes the majority of the issue, to the Bengal cause. It seems that he might have knowingly chosen to address the topic of death, hunger, and trauma repeatedly, without reducing it to only one limited special issue, as it sometimes happened, and mobilized his friends, fellow writers, and seniors to contribute to the activist cause of agitation and mobilization of funds and workforce in order to fight the results of this man-made disaster. This can be read as a statement and foundational stone of the debuting editor, who declared his magazine a stage for current topics and contemporary progressive authors wanting to deliver a statement piece. Literature opting for change and betterment, at the same time respecting differences and proclaiming brotherhood and solidarity with those less fortunate, cooperation and responsibility of literature and art. So let me maybe conclude with this. I could go on, but no time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kuruvoska. So many thoughts you've left us with. Just one small comment before I pass on the digital mic to Asmita yet again. I was particularly intrigued by something that you kind of also reiterated in the conclusion about the combination of the memory and forgetting when we're looking at the positioning of the translator and the editor as, it kind of gets eclipsed, their presence gets eclipsed as the urgent need to mobilize the magazine into the literary market becomes more important. And so kind of, how a part of that memory of all those who've been a part of the construction of this this kind of a narrative gets lost, gets eclipsed by more important capital needs of the literary market. So over to Asmita then, and I believe we have a couple of questions in the chat, and she'll take over from here on.
Thank you for that very riveting presentation, Dr. Kurvaska. So I have a question from someone. Given that Hindi narratives of the Bengal famine are not as extensively studied, can you discuss the significance of exploring these narratives, especially in the context of secondary trauma experienced by bystanders and writers during that period?
Thank you so much for this question. I mean, that is the main point, I would say, of this study. Since we have plenty of narratives in Bengali, naturally, and also many in English. And somehow that's how I started sort of being interested in these Hindi narratives, since many of those writers whom I mentioned and whom I didn't mention, they also actively took part in the mobilization and also collecting funds. But also many of them kind of were deployed to Bengal. They wrote for certain magazines or newspapers. They were reporters there. They sometimes, as a few of them I mentioned, they kind of accompanied groups, for example, of medical doctors who went there to vaccinate, help medically, and so on and so forth. So they were. Some of them were really witnessing what is happening especially in the later part of the famine after 44. So they were witnesses and they were reporting back home. Why is it important? To some extent, I thought that maybe one could juxtapose the Bengali and Hindi narratives, but this is not so much productive. I think what strikes me here is the sort of urgency of these authors to report back home. So the editorial pieces included in Hans, they continuously keep repeating that we have to stand up. You as readers and we as authors, this is our obligation. We should be all ashamed that we are not doing it before. So there is this, that's why I mentioned the idea of implicated subject as well. They think they are really responsible. They have to help. So that I think this is particularly important. What I was not able to do until now were more sort of like minor narratives. I was not able to find sort of like shorter pieces, but maybe because it is quite long time ago. So as for now, I was able to locate it only some of the literary journals, novels, and collections of stories. But I'm sure there is more. There are not so many narratives from women or female authors. So this is like still lacking. It's very elitist, I have to say, unfortunately, but still important. So thank you for this question.
Right. So I have so many questions, but due to the lack of time, I'm just going to give one more. Are there any parallels or contrasts between the Hindi narratives examined in the study and the Bengali and English works that have received more scholarly attention in the context of the Bengal famine?
Also, very interesting question. I would need like 10 minutes to address it. But yeah, I would say yes. So I partly mentioned it, that there are definitely motifs repeating, right? Because all these authors sort of read the same newspaper pieces. They were looking at very famous hunger documentations, photos, and art. So they all had similar inspiration. So this physicality of famine, typical images as, you know, like people, humans fighting with dogs or you know, birds of prey sitting next to the bodies, children, mothers, streets of Kolkata, people eating garbage and so on. So like imaginary is very similar. Also the political inclination of those authors is quite similar, so very engaged. Many of them members of the Communist Party, many of them progressive writers. So definitely Hindi and Urdu is very, very similar. Bangla sorry, I unfortunately don't read Bangla, so only the translated pieces I was able to read. So I'm assuming, and also form is very similar. So short stories and one-act plays are very prominent. And I could go on, but thank you for this question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am, for this wildly amazing presentation. So I don't see Suman here. Maybe she got disconnected.
I'm back. Here.
Hi. So if you have any more remarks, Suman?
Yeah, Dr. Kroska, I was kind of intrigued by the satirical literary pieces that you were talking about. If you could perhaps make a comment or two more on that. I mean, I was at a slightly different kind of a genre that you mentioned amongst all the other genres that you talked about. So perhaps a few thoughts on that. And yeah, that would be my only comment, question for you.
Thank you so much. It's also interesting term, satirical. I was, I think, referring to Krishnan Chanda's Andatta, which has this satirical element. So this is particularly, it's also translated into English. It's a very popular piece. It has this satirical element when he is literally mogging the elites of Kolkata and also the politicians. So it opens with this correspondence between, let's say, the two characters, fictional characters, leaders of fictional countries who exchange thoughts, and they basically argue about how it's not possible that the famine is there. And if they discover bodies on the streets, they argue that they are not there. Probably there's some sort of mysterious disease. And there are descriptions of bodies being removed from, or I think it was, there's an example of a child who is recovered, his mother is dead, and then this child kind of cannot be returned, so it has to be sent somewhere else, and they have to somehow get rid of this dead bodies from the streets because they are destroying the aesthetic view of the city. And I would say it has satirical elements, but this is very uncommon, I would say. All the other pieces are quite dramatic. I think also the poems by Chayavadi poets, they are a little bit different as well, because the aesthetic is different. They very much use their aesthetic of describing nature. So then they concentrate more of how sort of nature is in sync with what is happening to humans. So I think the style is a little bit different, but most of the pieces are progressive in nature.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your response, ma'am. Back to you, Asmita, I believe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kurvaska and Meghal and Revathy, for your very spectacular presentations. This is how the session comes to an end. And I thank Suman for being the chair for us, doing such an incredible job. And yes, so we will reconvene after a very short break at 4:35. Stay tuned.
I would just like to request everybody to switch on their cameras, especially the paper presenters, rapporteurs, chairs. So we can just take a quick photo for the session. Are we done? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.